Dr. Hatch, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here in your garden.
My
It's
pleasure.
beautiful. I heard you talk about being in Mount Bayou
Yes,
and with the soil there and how rich that soil was and how it was really important in your role with the community health centers to actually assist people in learning how to grow healthy foods.
yes, indeed. You know,
Yeah, and so, what are some of the things that you grow right now and how has that experience influenced you?
I grew up in a family network, and everybody sort of had a garden,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a source of pride. But it wasn't just pride and joy in growing it; it was eating it, and you sort of develop a taste for really, really fresh food. My desire for that kind of food never ended, so I'm still doing it.
That's excellent. That's excellent. We're coming off a historic election, and I know that you were involved with some of the reconciliation work in South Africa.
Yes.
What do you think it's going to take here in the United States to move past where we've been in the last few years?
I think certainly you speak of African American populations, some other people that are especially situated, like West Virginia, Kentucky, and the hills. There wasn't much there other than coal, and that's sort
Right.
of obsolete now. But I think a more equitable distribution of resources, and I'm speaking of the quality of education,
Mm-hmm.
the resources the nation invests in health services, because there still are literally millions of people who are still underserved and overstressed. And as long as that pertains, we'll have some of the differences that we observe. And I say the differential between college educated white men and those who are factory workers or miners in terms of life expectancy is 10, 11 years. And we're beginning to get sufficient numbers of black men who are earning better incomes to get measurements on African American populations too. But it's something wrong when some Americans live 10, 11 years longer than others, and the differential is not seeing the doctor, it's quality of life, the satisfaction with life,
Mm-hmm.
whether you believe you have achieved. And if you don't reach a goal, say that your parents did, whether you're black or white, that's going to cost you.
Mm-hmm.
So we need a better understanding of those factors, and then we need to take action to correct it. I don't know what it's like in Europe, say, where you do have more equitable distribution, like Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, places like that. I know there are social class differences in England, but I just don't know. Do you?
Well, we certainly have great divides here in the United States. And one of the things that I think we've seen as a country is just how divided it is in terms of health status, economics, as a result of COVID. COVID really has shone a light on disparities that have long existed and really exacerbated them. When you think about the fact that so many people had to work every day directly with customers,
Absolutely.
encountering different people, unique people, more people on a daily basis, and in essence, increasing their risk of exposure to COVID. And those very same people were more likely to be people of color, more likely to be people that are uninsured, have jobs that don't allow for sick pay, and in many instances were compelled to go to work even if they were symptomatic because they had no other means of income.
Yeah. I think, you know, when I was down in Mississippi, that was Tufts University, you know, and we were thinking of it in terms of social indicators of health. That if you get a social profile on a human being on this earth, it also predicts health status in most of the cases I know about. And so some of that is the knowledge base, some of it is opportunity structure. Say, going to the beach is not just a happy thing to do. It lowers the blood pressure,
Right.
makes one more content with life and living and things like that. And those are resources that are limited by the number of dollars you got in your wallet. So, you know, and I know I'm thinking that maybe most Americans don't think of the amenities in life and living as also contributing to longevity. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think about weathering, you know, just the stress on your body and what that does when you're under financial pressure or you're in social pressure. You feel you're in a situation or position where you're being oppressed.
Yeah.
those-
say if you get stressed out, problems with the wife or the kids, and you can take a nice trip to the mountains, that generally helps out a little bit,
Yes.
and you don't have to continue in a situation with no relief, no alternative pattern of living. And I know in this country we don't think that way.
Right.
Yeah.
And it also gives you something to look forward to. Gives you a sense of hope. And you know what's happened with this pandemic and the fact that it is continued as long as it has is it's created this sense of pandemic fatigue as well as to some degree hopelessness, particularly for people that lost a job or lost a loved one or in financial distress. Or, we're learning more about people that have had COVID and are having long-lasting health effects. We call them the long haulers. And just really beginning to understand what those complications are going to be and how they'll need to be managed over time. And, of course, we're still in a state that is yet to expand Medicaid. So we've got more than 500,000 people now that don't have health insurance.
Yeah. And the notion that the private system is more efficient is probably a social class illusion.
Mm-hmm.
And, the British have about the same health indicators that we do for, I know in infant mortality and longevity, about the same indicators we do, but we pay a whole lot more for
Right.
the medical care that we do get. And for people that are really money sensitive, one of the advantages of the government controlled health care would be a vast reduction in cost.
Absolutely.
And privately owned hospitals, physicians making $1 million a year might have to end if we are serious about taking care of all of our citizens.
And what we've seen from other countries that do have a healthcare system that really focuses on health, not just health care.
Yeah.
Looks at those things, those social indicators that they now refer to as the social determinants of health. And I always remember Dr. Hatch, you said they're not determinants; they are drivers of health. They don't.
Absolutely.
They don't have to be determinants.
Yeah.
And that has stuck with me because if we can think about, and we're doing a lot of that now at DHHS, putting a focus on making sure that people have access to food, access to transportation if they don't have it. And right now, we've been able to do that through some of our COVID relief dollars, particularly focusing on people that are isolated or in quarantine as a result of exposure or contracting COVID-19. Making sure that, if they don't have the ability to socially distance at home, that they've got an alternate place to stay until they do recover.
Yeah.
So all those things around housing and transportation and food security, we've known for years how important they are. I think now we're just starting to revisit those type of priorities and making those investments.
Yeah.
And hopefully that type of initiative will continue going forward and even be more expansive.
Well, I think a consciousness of these as factors that are driving health, we don't often think of it. I'm quite aware of my own family and its transition in this nation, and my memory or knowledge of what has happened to at least some of my family goes back to about 1800. My great-grandfather was born in 1824, and there was an economic crisis in this country in 1837. And a lot of the population was migrating from Virginia and Kentucky, going down to Louisiana and Mississippi and capturing the new lands. And a little bit later on, Texas was a part of that. And I remember one of the stories that still is alive in my family. We used to have a reunion every year when I was high school age. Was the great-grandfather's separation from his mother and two sisters that he never saw again. And that was part of the grandpa's life, was praying that the family would stay together. And this was as late as 1925, I think that's when he passed on. I wasn't in this world, but everybody talked about what Grandpa said. And Grandpa thought that in his lifetime, meeting the missionaries from Berea College,
in Kentucky, yeah.
Yeah, and it was assumed that, yes, black people would be free. He and his twin brother had been fortunate to manage to stay together until that time. But he never stopped looking for his mother or his sisters, even after they got at a point where the likelihood of their being alive was in doubt. So we were always aware of our obligation to each other.
Right.
And it affected some more than others. There was one cousin who in World War II was involved in Europe. And then when that ended, some people went to the Pacific to fight another war. So when Cousin BJ got back to Kentucky, people saying, well, where are you going? Are you going to Washington or Detroit or Pittsburgh? Because that's what young people did.
Right.
And he said, I'm tired and I don't want to go any place. I want to stay here until they throw me in the ground. And that's what he did. He died pretty well-off man, but he went through a lot of changes. There were many stresses during that passage. And when I became a little more sophisticated, I realized that migration is not an equal opportunity experience. Sometimes it depended on not only the insights a person took, but opportunity as well. And if you stayed in Kentucky, growing tobacco and a little bit of cotton, you'd be poor forever. At least all the people were pretty much, poor. And then they would go to Pittsburgh or Detroit. A few years later, they were coming back driving new automobiles. How that looked to those of us who weren't there is something else again. But if you live long enough, you begin to see the slippage of the quality of life of the children of the people who migrated. And I would attribute that to the loss of the social support from an intact family network that sort of looks after its people. And the fact that we had to, or at least we thought we did, have to leave home to find a safe, secure life meant that those support systems, the advice from the grandmother, or a brother or a cousin, ended for a lot of us. And I think, again, well, there are a few people who are studying in that area now about the impact on the Great Migration.
Yes.
And what happened to some of the people. And then, we know about the drug crises and what drives it. It could be isolation, it could be unstable family living, it could be that the communities they moved in couldn't offer the kind of stability that they could get in rural America. So I think the time is still right, especially to study and try to understand better the social factors that drive satisfaction with life, including health status. I'm aware of the phenomenal waste of young black men who fail to get educated, often shoot each other. And I think it's grounded in frustration, neglect, school systems that don't serve all the people well. And it took me a long time to figure some of these things out, and with some hope that it is at least been being studied to some degree now, but it's not a knowledge base that is available to a lot of decision makers of goodwill. And of course, my passion for working with churches. It's a source of identity, and I found those linkages, say here in North Carolina, and a lot of other places that I've lived, even in Massachusetts, in Boston. When you open up a neighborhood association meeting with song and prayer in sophisticated Boston, that tells you so.
Right. And there's work being done now really looking at...
I'm not hearing
well. Oh, I said there's work being done looking at the justice, they call it the justice-involved population, people that are coming out of state correctional facilities that need to have employment, but they also have healthcare related issues. They may have substance abuse related issues. And faith-based organizations as well as community organizations are coming to the table to provide resources and services. One of the challenges is so many of the systems right now are stacked against them. If they've got a criminal record in terms of being able to get employment, being able to get loans for education, being able to have a credit history to be able to even rent an apartment. So there's so many resources that they need so that they don't reoffend and go back into a correctional setting, because it can become a vicious cycle. I know that your work with community health workers, throughout your career, has really set the stage for how the power of community, how the power of individuals that are connected with faith-based organizations and community organizations can make a difference in achieving health equity.
Yeah, I think many people are unaware that these systems exist. I think it was West Indian women in Boston back in the 30s and 40s had refrigerator purchasing events where they could loan the person a certain amount of money to get an electric refrigerator. Through their weekly meetings and special events that they had.
Wow.
And my mother's family belonged to a network of burial societies. I think it was called the Cadentown Benevolent Association. My mother told me about it. She said that's where we went to find out what was going on in the world. And one of the great events in my grandfather's life was the Association of Associations had Booker T. Washington to come up from Tuskegee and talk to them about pathways to education and preparing for a house and things like that. And he thought that it was the best information he had ever received. Now, they didn't have much money, but what the association did was it encouraged a good going away party. And I thought it was uniquely black until I found myself in Boston working with Irish and Italians and Lithuanians. My job at that particular time was health promotion. So I was trying to get them involved in exercise and all the good things that are good for you. And they kind of said, well, John, that's nice. But we want to be put away and nicely, and we want to know where we can get somebody that'll treat us right, and we can go away with the kind of dignity that our families would have granted us in Europe. Well, and then I found out that it sort of rang everybody's bell, and that's okay, because they knew that if you saved a dime a week and you did it long enough, you'd eventually have enough money for a good going away party. With the Benevolent Association in Cadentown, Kentucky, my grandfather was a carpenter. So if a young couple married, and if they assembled the materials needed to build a house, members of the organization, maybe 6 men, would go and help the man of the family until they got the roof on. And then when you got the roof on, you were good to go.
Right.
Because then you could go at a slower pace.
Yeah.
But usually when you saw people stacking lumber and blocks and rocks behind the house, somebody was planning to build one, because we couldn't get loans.
Right.
And back in the 50s and 60s in North Carolina, unless you maybe lived in Durham where they had some black economic power,
Right.
you couldn't get a bank loan. So you had rural churches as far away as Fayetteville, and they were coming into Durham to get money to put a function room onto the church and bring plumbing indoor.
Right.
Well, that had a profound effect on people's thinking. And it did impact health because they began to think, well, if we can have running water and a flush toilet at church, maybe I can do this at home.
Right.
And they began to know that you could hire one person who maybe knew the pathway, and that person could lead other people on the building team. So I think it's that knowledge base, the realization that small steps can eventually lead to great distance in terms of moving upward, moving forward. And I don't know how many people, say in my family, know about the Cadentown Benevolent Association. I know it. People my age, or maybe people 20 years younger, know about it, but I don't know about these city-born people and those that were born, say, in Detroit
Right.
and Chicago. I don't know.
But it was that sense of mutual cooperation and working together.
Stop for just 1 second.
Say.
That folder is hitting your microphone.
Oh, I see.
Be careful, sorry. Be careful with holding.
Okay.
To that sense of community those benevolent associations have, being able to work collectively to help one person, and then that person knows they're going to be working collectively to help someone else.
Yes.
And when you think about the fact that those families had homes after that, and they didn't have a mortgage after that, it put them in a better place to be able to have some measure of wealth creation. And I really worry now about the younger generation and their ability to do that, because they're coming away with six-figure loans as a result of college education, the just being able to rent an apartment, a decent apartment, can cost them over $1,000-$1,200 a month. So their ability to be able to save, to pay off those college loans, to then be able to get a mortgage, I think it's going to be very challenging. It's really interesting to see that there are people now that are really thinking, do I need as much home? And they're looking at some of these small homes and actually doing some of those cooperative means of being able to actually create some properties. And of course, we've seen that with Habitat for Humanity in restoring properties for people. And it just shows really the power of community to be able to lift an individual and a family up. And how do we get back to that sense of community, particularly now, in our country where it seems like it's very divided?
Well, I've been living here 50 years. I knew when I first came, or there might have been 3, maybe 4 other black people on that campus
Right.
that were, faculty. I got to know a lot of the people that were housekeeping and yard men, people like that. And my father was pastoring churches about 20 miles from the campus. So I had this kind of dual vision where, up at the School of Public Health, this guy is a janitor, he pushes a broom. But out in the community, he may be the head man at the church.
Right.
That determines a lot of what goes on socially. And I remember the chairman of my department was kind of curious as to, well, how are you getting along in the community? And I guess people will seek you for a position of leadership. I said, kind of doubt that. I say, you know, but if you want to find a leader, you talk to Clyde. That's the guy that pushes the broom up and down this hall. He's an organizer. He's a visionary.
Mm-hmm.
He has 3 children, and he's got them in college. He's trustworthy. And that kind of surprised the guy Stewart, you know. And he said, well, what is your relationship? And I said, well, it kind of depends. And that most people try to find structure in an environment that's comfortable to them, and that I was doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
but I remember this again at School of Public Health. Maybe I'd been there a year, and one of the housekeeping men said, we'd like to have lunch with you sometime. I said, sure. And he said, well, you know, and he set a date, and a week or so ahead. And I went to have lunch with 3 housekeepers. Mm-hmm. And they had a table spread with a white cloth. And they said, look, we're glad you're here. And we pray for this kind of change. And if there's anything we can do to make it comfortable for you, we want you to know that we're with you. Well, that was probably one of the more deeply felt endorsements of my president than I'd ever had before. But the complexity of the relationship and how to be helpful without making assumptions about
Right.
social class, what people know, how much money they had. But it also requires vision of a journey that's a little bit different from the one that, say, most or many white Americans kind of assume, you know, this is the way it is, and I go to station 1, and then I should be at station 5 in 15 years. And the path, you know, for African Americans is different, you know, just like say with my family, it generally made that, you know, if you ever hope to get a new car, you better go to Detroit. And there was a time when that did result in better living. But not too many years ahead, you started making Ford Motors down in Mexico.
Right.
And buying the rear end someplace else so that the good paying union jobs gave way to something they called high tech. And my cousins were not high tech. They were strong, hard working folk. And it seemed that the opportunity structure had failed them, or maybe they'd taken the wrong path. Yeah, and I was fortunate enough to spend some of my years with my father and his cousins. And as I say, my father acquired carpentry skills. He could do drafting. He was a preacher. That's, you know, what you ask him what he did, that's what he did. But a cousin would engage him, John, I want to build a house. And oftentimes they would buy a piece of land, an acre or two, and try to find a piece of land with trees on it so they could cut it down and then cut it up into timber so they could build a house. except they didn't know how to build a house, but John did.
Right.
And then they would organize as family. This would be first cousins, second cousins, and their children. And even the people up north would come home on those occasions and try to fit in with the work crew that's building Papa a new house. And it worked pretty well for my family. So those are pathways and structures that, as I say, I think are somewhat unique, but I'm sure if you looked at the immigrant population, you'd find similar patterns that a lot of our systems do not support. So, my church is right in Durham on the freeway.
Mm-hmm.
Across the road, across the freeway from where we live, there's a 16-story building. 10 years ago, I'd say 80% of our neighbors, black people.
Right.
But then when people my age began to pass on, those people that build 16-story buildings come in and offer you a nice price for your house. So that the neighborhood nearest my church, I guess it's at least 80% white of the new buildings that are going up. And we don't quite know what to do, because there was a time when a housekeeper at Duke or Chapel Hill could look forward to owning a house. And they would raise their children and
Right.
would stay in the family, and and that ability is declining. Now there are new pathways. There are younger black people coming to RTI.
Mm-hmm.
They live out there in the bushes, and they might join a white church, and you have to say, well, you go to church where it fits for you.
Mm-hmm.
But the opportunity, or the people who are within the parameters of good health and opportunity, now have to have a lot more money.
Right.
And that worries me, because some of my friends, when they pass on, usually the house is sold, and if there are 3 kids, it's split 3 ways.
Yeah.
So we haven't found effective ways of coping with that. I like to hope that, say, some of the migration that, well, say, my own sons, I think if they had been white men, they would have found work around the corner. A couple of them are physicians. My daughter is here, but she is a speech pathologist.
Mm-hmm.
You gotta have connections internally, in order to be able to get the money to set up a practice, or even to be hired.
Right.
And there still are gaps, I know, within the healthcare structure that are driven by race. You just simply don't need black people in this area. And I think Durham is unique in that, you got Duke, you have Chapel Hill, and I think there's some possibility. It might be a deer coming through here most of the time.
That'll make for a good interview.
Yeah. But anyway, there certainly is a need to better understand those prior structures like the church that I think can have probably developed notions of how circumstances can be better. And I think we need to be better involved in, for example, the crime rate in Durham is outrageous. And you see these young men, and it is disproportionately young men who are, just not coping. Say, I didn't see a black doc for a long time in my life. And then I began to see them, they're all male. And now, the ratio of black men to women in medicine is 3-1,
Right.
favoring women.
Women, yeah. So what would you say to young African American professionals just coming up in a health career or in public health? What would be the strategies to achieve health equity in their generation?
I think some of these stresses that derail people need to be better understood. I'm concerned about my grandchildren, especially the males, and there are about 12 of them, just getting shot. And you can't just say, hey, don't ever touch liquor, or don't stay out till 3 o'clock in the morning. They're going to do it. At least somebody among them are going to do it. And I find myself just kind of anxious sometimes. And I say, well, if I can stay alive long enough to see them get gray hair, they'll be a little safer. But I kind of want to, well, okay, what if everybody, or not everybody, but a significant number of people began to model pathways that resulted in more money? That still doesn't solve my problem as an old black man up here, afraid that, a grandkid's going to get blown away by some cop who, is feeling his juice. And you say, well, why do you think this? Well, down in the Daytona Beach, his son is got a house on that intercoastal waterway, and he got a boat tied up and, stuff like that. There was a break-in, and the cops were in the community sort of trying to, where did the thief go? And the grandson went to the door when the cop knocked, and, well, no, what are you doing here? Kind of thing. And he said, well, I live here. Can you prove it? And he said, well, yeah, there's my picture's over the mantle. Okay, and this is kind of a gentle soul. Not all of my grandsons are gentle souls. And I wonder about, what can we as a society do to reduce the number of unfortunate events that lead to such disruption?
Yeah.
And, I don't know, but I still had hope. And I kind of thought 50 years ago that 50 years later that those concerns and fears would have lessened.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we certainly are in really challenging times. Really are. But, I always get a sense from you, a sense of hope and just solace in knowing the people that you've experienced, people you've encountered, and how they've made it and how you've been able to make it. and generations before us, and hopefully generations after us will persevere as well.
Well, yeah, and I know I talk about my grandmother a lot. All of my grandparents were slaves,
Right.
and I guess I was 8 or so when it was kind of agreed that I was big enough to go to church with Grandma, whose service opened at 5 in the morning on Sunday. She didn't go to the same service that my parents went to. And, because I was the only 8-year-old in the congregation, and sometimes there would be just such horrible screams.
Mm-hmm.
And people would be remembering or praying for and crying for relatives that they thought might be alive.
Mm.
And, and then my grandmother said, oh, well, there was this system called slavery, and 8 years old, I didn't quite understand what what that meant. But the thing that I still remember is her faith. And, Hap Chandler was a white man in our town that made it big. Hap was poor, really poor.
Mm-hmm.
And he became a senator, governor, and of heroic proportions, and his picture was on every lamppost. And I said, that's what I want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents said,
Mm.
and I understood what that meant.
Right.
Grandma said, well, I don't know. I've seen a whole lot of change in my life. And we just have to keep on praying and hoping that this world will change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And and I kind of was infected by that hope and that dream that this world will change.
Right.
We know it can happen. We've got the resources as a people, as a nation, to provide not only basic, but a good living for everybody.
That's right.
Good health care.
Yeah.
We can reduce the stresses that lead to madness, that lead to family breakups, that lead to dysfunction. We know a lot more than we used to in terms of how these forces interact in human societies. And we're pretty sophisticated in terms of the social factors that lead to dysfunction.
Right. We know what to do. We just need to have the will to do it.
Well, I sure don't know the answer, but I guess I have to say that I'm glad Trump is gone. I thought he was a dangerous person. In that what he hoped for was not related to the improvement of society. So, but understand money. It's a wonderful thing, and most people that get it feel happy about it. But how we can use the knowledge base that we have now. Maybe we felt some of these things 50, 100 years ago, but now we really have exquisite understanding, at least some of us do, of the impact of disassociation, or say, I think of automation, artificial intelligence. As a society, we're going to have to learn to live with that stuff.
Yeah. We're going to always have these new challenges that face us and the old realities that are there. Dr. Hatch, I just want to thank you so much for this opportunity we've had this afternoon. It's been a very rich conversation, and I look forward to many more. We thank you.
Well, it's certainly my pleasure. I wish I knew the answer.